Alright, moving right along, we're going to skip over a couple of steps while we're waiting for our fins underneath the books to dry, and we're also waiting for our engine mount tube to dry. We've got some extra fillets that I just put on both sides to give it some more strength. So we're going to move up to something we can do now. We can work on our transition between the body tube and the payload bay. So that goes between the clear payload bay and the body tube here that we have. So what we're going to do is we're going to prep this so that it's nice and pretty for paint. And first thing we're going to do is we're going to sand the bottoms so they're smooth. I already did that. Just took some sandpaper and just sanded it until it's nice and flat and smooth. So now it's ready for our little screw eye. So we're going to take that and we're going to center it in the center. We're just going to screw it right in. We're going to go ahead and go all the way up until it sinks in, right up to the shoulder of the screw eye. We don't want to overturn, so as soon as it's tight, go ahead and stop. Now we're going to back it out. Some people will say use CA glue, some people will say use epoxy. I'm just going to go ahead and use wood glue or white glue. I'm not too awfully worried about having a lot of strength in this, as much as I am worried about just making sure that it soaks in. And the wood glue is going to dry slower and longer, so to me that means it's going to soak into the balsa a little bit better. So we'll go ahead and squirt that in there. I'm just going to put a dab right there. And then we're going to screw the screw eye right back into it. Now, after the fact, you can put a little epoxy clay around this. You can put a little bit of epoxy around it. And that will give it a little bit more of a bind to the nose cone possibly, or the transition possibly. But in my book, just a little Elmer's glue until it's barely tight, and we're good to go. Okay, we don't have to stop there because we still have to prep the wood itself for paint. Now we're not going to be painting it for quite some time, but we can still get the wood all nice and pretty. So we're going to be using wood filler, some water to water it down, and a paintbrush. So let's go ahead and open up our wood filler. What I've done is I've actually put a piece of plastic on top of the wood filler that helps keep it from drying out. We're going to take a blob of wood filler. We're going to go ahead and put it in our cup. And we're going to add a little bit of water. Let me put a little bit more in there. Rather have a little bit too much and not enough, because I can always add it back to the container. Okay. Now plastic over the top of my wood filler, that actually helps keep it from drying out as time goes by. So now we're going to add a little bit of water, and I'm going to make this pasty. I don't want it to be too awfully thin, but I don't want it to be really, really thick either. I want to be able to use my paintbrush to paint it on to the balsa wood. And by being able to paint it on, it's going to sand a lot easier. It's going to just overall be a lot easier to handle and work this. Now obviously I only have to do this where we're going to be seeing the wood. So that's going to be through the transitional part and through the upper portion. So I don't have to paint the whole thing with the wood putty. Well, how do I keep from getting it where I don't want it? Blue painter's tape. Anytime I'm going to be pulling the tape back off, I use blue or green painter's tape because it's not as strong of an adhesive. It's not going to grab onto it, and I never use anything but blue painter's tape or green tape on body tubes because you will pull the paper right off the spiral if you're not careful. And no matter how much you practice, it's just, you're flirting with disaster. Okay, so now a lot more tape than I need, but I'd rather have a little bit more than not enough. And by folding over the end, it makes it easy to find it and pull it off after you're done. So we're just going to take our brush now, and we're going to go ahead and dab this on. And I'm not too worried about putting it on too thick, because we sand most of it off anyways. I'd rather put it on enough to cover it and be done with it now than have to sand again later because I didn't quite fill it. So we're going to paint it all around. And yeah, it looks like I mixed it plenty. Okay. Making sure I get into every nook and cranny. And we'll go ahead and do the top two because that will be visible. We'll smooth it out a little bit. Now we can let this sit for a couple minutes and set up and then do another coat right over the top of a partially dry coat. That's okay. I've done it before. It doesn't really affect it. You just have to make sure you let it dry a good solid 24 hours before you sand it. So I'm going to set this off to the side to dry. I've got little racks all over that I set things up on to dry. So now we're going to let that dry up, and then we'll sand it down and we'll have it ready for painting after we finish gluing everything together. We're not going to glue the transition on top, the payload on top of the transition, just because we need to paint that first. So we'll actually be painting that transition before we assemble the rest of the rocket. So basically the upper portion of the rocket is going to be assembled very, very last after all painting's done. And that way we have a clean, neat looking transition. Alrighty, so we're going to continue on with our next step. Alright, we're into the next part of our build. We have the fins. We let them dry overnight. And I've taken a pair of scissors and I carefully trimmed off a lot of the major excess with a pair of scissors, being careful not to cut into the balsa wood. So now our next step is going to be to trim off this excess that we still have on it. Then we're going to use some thin super glue, and we're going to super glue the paper on the edges of the fin. That's going to reinforce that edge and give us the ability to get rid of any fuzz or any other issues we may have with sanding. So we're just going to trim it by carefully running along the edge. And again, this is why we pushed down with our fingernail while we were putting the skin on. We used our fingernail to give us that definition of where the beginning of the fin was, so that we can come back later and trim this off without too much problem. So we're just running through lightly. I'm not trying to cut through both sides at the same time. Just enough to get through the paper. Then we pop it off. So we're going to do that all the way around all the fins. Just go ahead and trim. And go ahead and take your time doing this. You don't have to do it fast. And again, this is why you want to have a very, very sharp hobby knife. Less chances of accidentally trimming off a rough trim instead of getting a nice smooth trim. Now you're going to have some fuzz. You're going to have some pieces of paper where it's going to kind of do some funny stuff. That's why we're going to do the super glues. We're going to take care of that with the super glue. This is the root edge. I make sure I get all that off the root edge. The root edge is your most important edge out of all the edges, because remember, that's where it adheres to the rocket. So if you don't get that one flat, get rid of all the paper, it's really going to be a hassle for you when it comes time to mount it to the rocket body. So we'll just keep going around and trim it. Okay, a little bit there. Alright. Now if you're really careful, you can use scissors to do some of the trimming. Like I am right now, I've got a piece that just doesn't want to let go. So I use the scissors to get that little piece off. Okay, so now we've got that done. Our next step is going to be to use the thin CA glue all around the edges. And this is going to allow us to sand any extra that we have on there off without damaging it. That's a lot more than I need, but once I'm done all the way around, I'm going to take one of my towels. I go through more towels this way, but paper towel, cloth towel, whatever you use, and we're going to wipe that excess off. Now it's still wet, so don't put it down on anything yet. Got to let that dry fully. We'll flip it over and do the other side while we're waiting. So you can see how that absorbs into the paper all the way around the edges. Excuse me. Wiping off the excess again. And we're going to let that dry for a few seconds before we put it down. Otherwise we'll be trying to get it off our table. So I'm going to complete the other ones, and then after we're done with that, we're going to be mounting them. So again, we're going to trim off with an X-Acto knife and scissors as much excess as we possibly can without getting into the balsa wood. We want to leave as much paper on the wood as possible. Because you can't sand the paper, even with the super glue on there, the CA glue on there, if you sand the paper, it's going to show a sand line where the paper and the wood meet. So we want to be sure we don't over sand anything. We're going to lightly, with a 220 grit, just kind of go over the edge, and I'll show you when we actually do the sanding, to make all that fuzz and extra paper disappear, what little bit is left. And we're going to do the same thing to sand our root edge flat again to make sure that it's smooth and flat for good mounting to the wall of the body tube that we're going to be doing later on. So we're going to finish that up, come back, show you how to do the sanding, and then we'll actually get into the mounting on the wall of the fin tube. We've got the 3 fins super glued. Both sides are super glued on all 3 fins. So we're ready to go ahead and do the sanding. This has had a little bit of time to dry now. You can let it dry for about a half hour or so until you think it's dry enough, and then sand it. I've had friends ask me, "Hey Ken, I know you skin your fins, but can I still do the balsa filling or the wood putty and still skin it for the strength purposes?" By all means you can, and it just helps even more with the appearance of the fin, because now you definitely won't have any grain showing through. But this is for finishing and strengthening purposes, so you can do wood putty or wood dope or however you want to, and it's not going to affect how you skin it. The skinning is really for strength more than anything else. So now we're going to go ahead and sand the root edge first, just like you normally would. Hold it straight up and down, give it a little sand. And we look at it and you can see there's a little bit of fuzz on the edge of the fin. So we do have a little bit of fuzz showing up there now. And that's not a problem, because what we're going to do is we're going to take the sandpaper now and we're going to feather that fuzz off just by going like this on the side. So we can run along the edge, and I'm not really pushing hard at all. And we do the other edge. And now if you look, all that fuzz is gone and it's nice and smooth now. So for the rest of it, we can't really sand too much, again, because if you sand too much, you're going to risk exposing the wood. So we just take and we're going to sand any fuzz, any excess we see. We're going to sand that off straight on the edge and just kind of come over the top. So we sand the edge over the top, and we just keep doing that all the way around until we're happy with the results we have. And again, just remember, you can't sand too much, because if you sand all the way through the paper, it will be visible unless you do a whole lot of primer work on the rocket. So just sand your root edge, until it's flat and smooth again. Feather off that side, make sure it's nice and clean, and then clean up the rest of your edges, get all the fuzz off. Then you'll be ready to go ahead and start mounting it to the body tube. So our next step, as soon as we finish the other two fins, we'll be mounting on the body tube. Alright, as you can see, we've got the fins nice and pretty now. They're very well defined. The edges are back the way I like them to be. A little fuzzy on the camera, but there's no paper fuzz up and down the edges. All the excess on the sides have been removed. And you can see that the glue, CA glue, actually coats into that paper and wood quite well, giving it a good bond. So now we're going to be using the fin jig, the Estes fin assembly jig. And what I like to do is I actually like to put the fin on and set my height and everything as best as I can. Things are going to move around and I'm going to have to adjust as I go, but get things kind of close to where it's actually going to be. And we're going to slide that on there. Okay. Now we just have to make sure that we have our fin marks close to where they're supposed to be, so our launch lug lines up the way it's supposed to line up. Alright, so now something I do a little bit different than everybody else, and it's a technique I learned a long time ago. I can't even remember where I learned it from, but it is great for putting on your fins. We're going to take, and I'm using a wood glue now. I've actually switched up to actual wood glue because I want the strongest bond possible. And we're going to put just a light coating of wood glue down the edge of this fin. And I may have to switch to my other bottle. So we'll switch to the other bottle. That one seems to be a little clogged. And we're just going to put a light dabbing of glue all the way down the fin. Now, got my rag ready. I'm going to take my finger and I'm going to dab all the way up and down that glue line that I just made. I'm going to make sure I've spread it evenly all up and down the fin edge. Now, I'm going to hit the clock. And we're going to wait exactly 1 minute. This is giving the glue, I've taken off any real excessive amount of glue, and it's letting the glue soak into the fibers a little bit on the wood, but it's also kind of setting up a little bit right now. And this is going to help make it grab the rocket body a lot better. If you're doing it manually, you're not using a fin jig and you just have something that you're propping your rocket up on while the fin dries, then rotating it and doing another one, you'll find it works a lot better for that. I've got my own little, what I used to use is a block of wood that I actually carved a channel down, and that channel allowed me to set a rocket tube into that channel, and I could rotate it. If I needed to, I could hang it off the edge of the table and rotate it as I put my fins on. I used that for years and years and years, and now I finally got the Estes fin jig. So we're using that, and one day I'll be fancy and I'll afford the guillotine fin jig, which I think is an awesome product. Okay, there's 1 minute on our clock. So we're going to attach the fin now. And again, I do this because it seems to make the fin grab real quick. Okay, slide her up till we're touching. Let's check our alignment. And we're right about the bottom of the tube. So we're looking good there. Now we'll do our next one. Again, we're going to add our glue on. And I'm going to apologize for my rambling and my camera angles right now. I'm still getting used to having a camera view this angle, and it's proven some challenges for coordinating my hand directions and which way I'm looking and what I'm doing. Okay, let's hit start. We're going to wait a minute. So pretty much after we get this done, we're at a standstill for doing anything with the lower section of the rocket from that point forward, because we now have, wipe off some glue I got there. We now have to wait for the glue to fully dry before we can do anything else. So with that in mind, I'm going to be looking at what can I do to my rocket that's not going to be messing with this while it's drying. We can sand things that need to be sanded. We can mark upper tube. We can mark the coupler, because we need to divide that in half so we can hook it to the lower half when we get it done. There's just all sorts of things that you can do. We can turn around, and like I was waiting for some stuff to dry, I actually primed my adapter. So now I can sand it, and I can do another coat of primer on it if I need to. There's our minute. So now we're going to attach this one. And we're going to slide that up. I'm a little low. Pull that up here and look. Make sure we're even with the bottom of the tube. And that we are. And like I said, this grabs almost instantly. So be really, really sure when you put it on there that you're being careful and paying attention and due diligence, because it will grab pretty quick. Now, yeah, you can pull it off and adjust if you need to, but then you're wiping your rocket off because you got glue somewhere you didn't want it. So we want to avoid that if at all possible. Okay, dab some glue on. Blot it with my finger, and it doesn't take a whole lot. As you can see, I'm not putting a whole lot. That last one I put a little more than I normally would. Just enough to coat the edge just a little bit. It does not take a whole lot of glue to grab it on. The more glue doesn't mean it's going to be a stronger grip. It just means it's going to take it longer to grab and dry, because you're still squishing a lot of glue out of that space any way you look around it. So let's start our clock up. And we've got another minute on the clock. Now you can take something like a framing square and make sure that your fins are straight up and down. There's all sorts of things you can do to make sure that your fins are going to be straight and true, and you're not going to have the issues of spin on the way up, or the rocket turning funny or twisting. That's an advantage the fin jig has, the fin guillotine has over the Estes, is the fact that it's holding the entire length of the fin and the body tube perfectly aligned, whereas this, it can tilt. Obviously these can tilt back and forth in the jig, and that's where you might get a slight misalignment, thus leading to the rocket kind of having an angle. There's 1 minute. A little bit of an angle on liftoff and spin or something. A little low, so let's bring that up. Come on. Get your clamp back on there. And let's come up a little bit. There we go. Push you in a little bit more there. Slide her off and a little low. Bring her up. And she's got a bit of a tip to her, so let's go ahead and make sure she straightens up. There we go. So now we've got all our fins on. I'm checking my alignment lines. Everybody appears to be straight up and down. So we've got them all in there nice and pretty. And let's do a little check here with our framing square. I love my framing square. Alright, that one's, I'm happy with that one now. So we're going to go ahead and let that glue finish setting. After it sets, we can do an epoxy coat, we can do a glue fillet, or you can just go ahead and move on to your epoxy clay fillet if you want to do that. All depends on what you're comfortable with using. While we're waiting for the fins to dry, we've done all this stuff with scuffing our tubes, marking our coupler, and doing some of these other things. Now we're going to fit things together in a dry fit fashion. And what I'm looking for here is there a wobble in the tube at all. So I'm going to get a flat table and I'm going to roll my tube, and I'm looking for a funny wobble in the tube. It's rolling straight. I'm not seeing any funny kind of wobbles or anything like that. This looks like it's straight there. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to mark the tube and the coupler. Now there's a reason we're doing this, so that when we put it together, we're going to be able to put it back together the exact same way we just had it. Why do we want to do that? Well, because we want to have this alignment right. When we get ready to mount to the fins, I'm going to actually hang it over the edge of the desk, and I'm going to roll that. I'm going to have the fin can, or the fin assembly, attached to the edge, and it's going to be hanging over the edge of the table, and I'm going to roll it. I'm going to look for that fin assembly to wobble or do any funny wiggles or anything like that. That's going to let me know whether this is straight or not. And I'm going to turn it a little bit and spin it, and turn it and spin it, and turn it and spin it until I'm sure that I have it straight and true and there's no wiggle or wobble in it. Now I'm going to have a rocket that's going to fly straight up. It's not going to go funny because the fins are canted at an angle on the bottom because the tubes aren't straight. The tubes, just for example, I'm going to grab a couple other tubes here. Instead of being straight, the tubes are at a little bit of an angle. You know, this is an extreme view of it, but we want to try and avoid that because that does affect the flight characteristics of a rocket. So now I've got this mark. I can go ahead and glue this adapter, or this coupler, into the tube. Now I can switch back to my white glue with this, or I can use the wood glue. It doesn't matter. To me, at this point, it's not as big of a deal. I'm going to go ahead and squirt some wood glue in there. And again, when you're doing couplers and adapters, don't be scared to use a lot of glue. Don't go crazy overboard, but don't be scared to use a lot of glue, because if you use too little of glue, I'm going to smear it around in there. As soon as you start sliding it in, it's going to seize up and grab very, very hard. Okay, so we wipe off the finger, we bring our towel just in case we have oopsies. Clean up the edge of the tube here. I missed just a bit of the tube. So we got good coverage. Now we're going to grab it, and there's our mark, and there's our mark. Let's slide them in together. One nice smooth motion. And line up our marks. We're at our marks round, and we're our mark left to right. So I'm happy with that. Let's look inside. I got a lot of excess glue that I can now wipe out with my finger, just by sticking it up there. Now again, because we have glue inside the tube, we got to be careful which way we put this tube, or we'll have the glue settle in a funny manner and we'll have to pick it out of the tube or whatever. So if we leave it laying on its side, any glue is going to go around the tube and puddle down on the bottom. And now we have a puddle of glue down on the bottom that's going to throw the weight of the rocket off. So I'm going to wipe out as much excess as I can from the inside, and then I'm going to either put it straight up and down. Now I'm going to do it this way because I'm not worried about the glue running down inside the tube and interfering with mounting the motor tube or anything else, because that's on the other side. All that's going to be going in here is a shock cord and the parachute, maybe an altimeter or electronics or something of that nature, but I'm not too worried about if any little bit of glue runs down the tube in here like I was inside the motor tube. So now we can let this dry. It'll be dry tomorrow, along with the fins will be fully set tomorrow, and we'll be able to take and mount these two tubes together. So again, I'm going to check one more time, just because I like to check and double check that this is standing straight up And my speed square says that the tube is standing straight up. All the fins are straight up and down on their lines that we drew on the tube for the fin markings. So everything's looking good here. Now it's just a matter of letting the glue dry fully. And go ahead and take the time. Let the glue cure. Don't try and rush glue curing, because that's where you're going to run into bad bonds and troubles with that. So always let it take the time to dry fully. So we got the minions here. Going to put them to bed, and going to put this to bed for the night. And we'll start our next few steps tomorrow. So see you tomorrow.